Marcus had been cleaning the imperial palace floors for 3 years, and, in all that time, he had never once looked directly at Empress Lyralii Vexthera. The Wolf Empress of the Dracmirian Empire was known throughout 7 star systems as the most feared ruler in the galaxy. Her silver fur gleamed like starlight, her amber eyes could freeze blood in veins, and her razor-sharp claws had personally ended the lives of countless enemies who dared challenge her rule. But Marcus was just a janitor. A human janitor, no less, which made him practically invisible in the grand halls of the palace. While other species bowed and trembled when the Empress passed, Marcus simply continued mopping, his head down, his movements efficient and quiet. The Dracmirian Empire stretched across 47 worlds, each one conquered through the Empress's brilliant military strategies and ruthless determination. Her throne room was a testament to her power, carved from the bones of ancient space leviathans, decorated with the banners of defeated enemies, and positioned at the center of a chamber so vast that whispers echoed for minutes. That throne had been built for one. Every Dracmirian ruler before her had sat alone, commanding respect through isolation and intimidation. The design was intentional, a single seat that elevated the ruler above all others, surrounded by empty space that no one dared cross without permission. On this particular day, Marcus was cleaning the throne room during the early morning hours, as was his routine. The Empress held court later in the day, so he had learned to complete his work before the nobility arrived with their endless complaints and political maneuvering. He pushed his cleaning cart quietly across the polished stone floor, careful not to let the wheels squeak. The throne room doors opened with a heavy grinding sound that made Marcus freeze. It was far too early for court to begin. He glanced up and saw the Empress herself entering, her long silver robes flowing behind her like liquid mercury. She moved with the predatory grace of her wolf-like species, each step deliberate and measured. Marcus immediately bent back to his work, hoping to remain unnoticed. But, as he scrubbed at a stubborn stain on the floor, he became aware that the familiar sound of the Empress's footsteps had stopped. When he finally dared to look up, she was standing directly in front of him, her imposing 7-foot frame casting a shadow over his kneeling form. "Human," she said, her voice carrying the distinctive growl that marked her species. "What is your name?" Marcus's throat went dry. In 3 years of working in the palace, the Empress had never spoken directly to him. He had always assumed she was unaware of his existence. "Marcus Chen, your Imperial Majesty," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The Empress studied him with those unsettling amber eyes. Marcus had heard that she could read fear in a person's scent, that she could detect lies through subtle changes in heartbeat and breathing. He tried to remain as calm as possible, though his hands trembled slightly as he gripped his cleaning cloth. "You have been cleaning my palace for 3 years," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Your Majesty. And, in all that time, you have never once tried to approach my throne. Never attempted to gain my attention. Never sought advancement or reward." Marcus wasn't sure if this was good or bad. "I am here to clean, Your Majesty. Nothing more." Something flickered in the Empress's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. She had ruled for 15 years, and, in that time, every person who had entered her presence had wanted something from her. Power, money, titles, favors, mercy. But, this human seemed genuinely content to remain in the background, invisible and unnoticed. "Stand," she commanded. Marcus rose to his feet, acutely aware of how small he appeared next to the towering Empress. Even among humans, Marcus was considered average in height, but, next to a Dracmirian, he felt like a child. The Empress walked slowly around him, her claws clicking softly against the stone floor. Marcus could feel her studying him, taking in every detail of his appearance. His uniform was clean but worn, his dark hair slightly disheveled from work, his hands calloused from years of manual labor. "Tell me, Marcus Chen," she said as she completed her circle and faced him again, "what do you think of my empire?" The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked for his opinion about anything, let alone matters of galactic politics. "Your Majesty, I'm not qualified to have opinions about such things." "I'm not asking for your qualifications. I'm asking for your thoughts." Marcus hesitated, unsure if honesty was wise in this situation. But, the Empress's gaze was piercing, and he had the feeling that she would detect any attempt at deception. I think your people are very efficient, he said carefully. The palace runs smoothly. The staff knows their duties. There's order here that I haven't seen in other places. Other places? Before I came here, I worked on several different worlds. Human colonies, mostly, but also some mixed species stations. There was always chaos, arguing, inefficiency. Here, things work. The Empress nodded slowly. And, what do you think of the fact that humans are considered a lesser species in my empire? Another dangerous question. Marcus chose his words very carefully. I think every species has different strengths, Your Majesty. Drachmerians are natural leaders and warriors. Humans, we're good at adapting, at finding solutions to problems, at working hard even when no one notices. And, you're content with that? Being unnoticed? Marcus looked directly at her for the first time, meeting those amber eyes despite his fear. I'm content with being useful, Your Majesty. Being noticed isn't always a good thing. For the first time since entering the throne room, the Empress smiled. It was a small expression, barely visible, but unmistakably there. In 15 years of rule, very few beings had managed to surprise her, and fewer still had done so while maintaining their composure in her presence. Return to your duties, she said finally. But, tomorrow, you will begin cleaning the throne room during court hours. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. Cleaning during court hours meant being present while the Empress conducted the business of the empire, surrounded by nobles and officials and military commanders. It meant being visible to hundreds of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Your Majesty, I'm not sure that's appropriate. Are you questioning my judgment, human? The growl in her voice made it clear that this was not a suggestion or a request. It was a command. No, Your Majesty. I will do as you ask. Good. You may go. Marcus gathered his cleaning supplies as quickly as possible and headed for the door, his mind racing with questions and concerns. Why had the Empress spoken to him? What did she want? And why did he have the unsettling feeling that his quiet, invisible life was about to change dramatically? As he reached the massive doors of the throne room, he heard the Empress speak again, her voice carrying clearly across the vast chamber. Marcus Chan. He turned back, expecting to see her still standing in the center of the room. Instead, she had moved to her throne and was settling into it with fluid grace. Tomorrow, pay attention to how my court operates. I may have questions for you afterward. With that cryptic statement, she dismissed him with a wave of her clawed hand. Marcus bowed quickly and escaped through the doors, his heart still pounding from the encounter. That evening, Marcus sat in his small quarters in the servants' wing of the palace, trying to make sense of what had happened. His room was sparse but comfortable: a bed, a small desk, a window that looked out over the palace gardens. It was more luxury than most humans in the empire could expect, and he had always been grateful for it. But, now, as he replayed his conversation with the Empress, he couldn't shake the feeling that his position was about to become much more complicated. The next morning arrived far too quickly. Marcus made his way to the throne room with his cleaning cart, his stomach tight with anxiety. When he arrived, the great chamber was already filled with courtiers and officials, all dressed in their finest robes and displaying their various species equivalent of formal attire. The throne itself dominated the room, elevated on a platform that required visitors to look up at the Empress as she conducted business. Marcus had never paid close attention to the court proceedings before, but now he found himself observing every detail as he quietly went about his cleaning duties. The Empress sat with perfect posture, her silver fur immaculate, her ceremonial armor polished to a brilliant shine. Around her neck hung the Chain of Command, an ancient artifact that symbolized her absolute authority over the Empire's military forces. In her right hand, she held the Scepter of Judgment, carved from the horn of the first beast she had killed in single combat. As the hours passed, Marcus watched as a steady stream of petitioners approached the throne. Some came seeking trade agreements, others requesting military aid for their worlds. A few brave souls even brought complaints or suggestions for improving imperial policy. What struck Marcus most was not the content of these interactions, but the pattern. Every single petitioner approached the throne with the same mixture of fear and ambition. They wanted something from the Empress, whether it was wealth, power, or simply her approval. And every single one of them maintained a careful distance from the throne itself, stopping at the designated line that marked the boundary between the subjects and their ruler. The throne had been designed for one person, and one person alone. During a brief break in the proceedings, while courtiers whispered among themselves and the Empress reviewed documents handed to her by her advisors, Marcus found himself studying the throne more carefully. It was indeed a magnificent piece of craftsmanship, but, as he looked at it, he began to see something else. The throne was isolated. Magnificent, intimidating, powerful, but utterly alone. For 15 years, the Empress had sat in that seat by herself, making decisions that affected billions of lives across dozens of worlds. She was surrounded by people, but none of them were truly with her. They were subjects, servants, advisors, supplicants. But not companions. As this realization dawned on him, Marcus made a mistake that would change everything. He looked up from his cleaning and caught the Empress's eye. For just a moment, their gazes met across the vast throne room, and, in her amber eyes, he saw something he had never expected to see. Loneliness. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the usual imperial composure, but Marcus had seen it. And, somehow, he had the feeling that she knew he had seen it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of court business and careful cleaning. Marcus managed to complete his duties without causing any disruptions, and, when the last petitioner had been dismissed and the courtiers had filed out of the throne room, he began packing up his supplies. Marcus Chen. The Empress's voice stopped him in his tracks. He turned to see her still seated on her throne, but now the vast chamber was empty except for the two of them. Approach. Marcus's legs felt unsteady as he walked across the polished stone floor. He had never crossed the boundary line before, never ventured into the sacred space immediately surrounding the throne. Each step felt like a violation of some fundamental law of the universe. When he reached the base of the platform, he stopped and bowed low. "What did you observe today?" the Empress asked. Marcus straightened, meeting her gaze with effort. "I observed that you are very skilled at managing the complex needs of a diverse empire, Your Majesty. The decisions you made were fair and well-reasoned." "That's not what I asked." Her voice carried a hint of impatience. "What did you observe about the court itself? About the interactions between myself and my subjects?" Marcus hesitated, unsure how honest he should be. But the memory of that moment of vulnerability he had glimpsed in her eyes gave him courage. "I observed that you sit alone, Your Majesty." The Empress went very still. For a long moment, the only sound in the throne room was the distant hum of the palace's environmental systems. "Explain." "Every person who approached you today maintained their distance. They came seeking something from you, but none of them came simply to be with you. You rule millions, but you rule them from isolation." Marcus expected anger, perhaps even violence. Instead, the Empress leaned back in her throne and studied him with renewed interest. "And what would you suggest I do about this observation?" "I wouldn't presume to make suggestions to Your Majesty. I'm just a janitor." "You're a human," she said, and there was something different in her voice now. "Your species has a reputation for finding unconventional solutions to seemingly impossible problems. So I ask again, what would you suggest?" Marcus looked up at the magnificent, isolated throne, then back at the Empress who sat upon it. An idea began forming in his mind, so audacious that he almost dismissed it immediately. But the loneliness he had glimpsed in her eyes gave him the courage to speak. "The throne was built for one," he said slowly. "But perhaps it doesn't have to remain that way." The silence that followed Marcus's words stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The Empress remained perfectly still, her amber eyes fixed on his face as if trying to read the thoughts behind his suggestion. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, and he began to wonder if he had just committed treason by implying that the sacred throne of the Draknirian Empire could be modified. "You suggest altering a throne that has stood unchanged for over 300 years, the Empress said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "A throne that represents the absolute authority of the Draknirian ruler. A throne that every emperor and empress before me has sat upon alone." "I suggest nothing, Your Majesty," Marcus replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "I merely observed that solutions sometimes require looking beyond traditional constraints. The Empress rose from her throne with fluid grace, her 7-foot frame casting a long shadow across the platform. She descended the steps slowly, each movement deliberate and predatory. Marcus forced himself to remain still as she approached, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the intricate patterns in her silver fur and smell the faint scent of the exotic oils used in her grooming rituals. This close, her presence was overwhelming raw power and authority that had been shaped by years of absolute command. "Tell me, human," she said, her voice dropping to a low growl, "what makes you think you understand the burdens of imperial rule?" Marcus met her gaze, surprising himself with his own boldness. "I don't understand them, Your Majesty. But I understand loneliness. I've spent 3 years being invisible in your palace, watching from the shadows while others interact and form connections. I know what it's like to be surrounded by people and still be fundamentally alone." Something flickered in the Empress's eyes again, that same vulnerability he had glimpsed earlier, quickly hidden but unmistakably there. "And you believe that sharing this throne would somehow remedy that loneliness?" "I believe that sometimes the most effective solutions are also the most unexpected ones." The Empress turned away from him, pacing to one of the tall windows that looked out over the capital city of New Drachmeria. The view was spectacular, towering spires reaching toward the sky, flying vehicles weaving between buildings like schools of metallic fish, and, in the distance, the spaceport where ships from across the galaxy arrived daily with tribute, trade goods, and reports from the far reaches of the Empire. "Do you know how I came to power, Marcus Chen?" "Only what everyone knows, Your Majesty. You led the military coup that overthrew your cousin, Emperor Thaindok, after he proved unable to handle the rebellion in the outer systems. That's the official history." The Empress's voice carried a note of bitter amusement. "The truth is more complicated. Thaindok wasn't just incompetent, he was weak. He surrounded himself with sycophants and yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. When the rebellions began, he was so isolated in his bubble of false reassurances that he couldn't even comprehend the scope of the threat." She turned back to face Marcus, her expression intense. "I swore when I took this throne that I would never make his mistakes. I would never allow myself to be blinded by flattery or isolated by protocol. And, yet..." She gestured toward the magnificent throne that dominated the chamber. "Here I sit, alone, making decisions based on reports filtered through layers of bureaucracy, speaking only to people who want something from me." "But, you're still an effective ruler," Marcus said. "The Empire is prosperous, stable, secure. Whatever isolation you might feel, it hasn't interfered with your ability to lead. Hasn't it?" The Empress returned to her throne, settling into it with a thoughtful expression. "How can I be certain? How do I know that my perspective isn't becoming as skewed as my cousin's was? How do I know that the reports I receive are complete and accurate rather than carefully edited to avoid my displeasure?" Marcus considered this, understanding beginning to dawn. "You want someone with no agenda. Someone who has nothing to gain from telling you what you want to hear. I want someone who sees the Empire from the bottom up rather than the top down. Someone who understands how imperial policy affects the ordinary citizens who actually keep the machinery of civilization running." The Empress leaned forward slightly. "I want a perspective that no noble or advisor or military commander can provide." "And you think a human janitor can provide that perspective?" "I think a human janitor who has spent 3 years observing my court without being observed in return might have insights that others lack." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as the full implications of this conversation became clear. "Your Majesty, are you asking me to become some sort of advisor?" "I'm asking you to sit beside me during court sessions. To observe the same proceedings I observe, but from your unique perspective. To tell me what you see that I might miss." The audacity of the proposal left Marcus speechless for a moment. A human, a member of a species considered inferior by most of the galaxy, sitting beside the most powerful ruler in known space. It was unprecedented, scandalous, potentially catastrophic. "Your Majesty, such an arrangement would cause enormous disruption. Your nobles would be outraged. Your enemies would see it as a sign of weakness. Your allies might question your judgment." "Let them question," the Empress said with a predatory smile. "I've built this empire through unconventional strategies. Perhaps it's time for another one. Over the following days, rumors began circulating through the palace about strange modifications being made to the throne room. Workers had been seen carrying materials and tools into the chamber during off hours, always under heavy guard and sworn to secrecy. The court buzzed with speculation about what the Empress might be planning. Marcus found himself caught in an uncomfortable limbo during this period. He continued his normal duties, but the Empress had made it clear that his role was about to change dramatically. He spent hours thinking about the conversation they'd had, wondering if he had somehow misunderstood her intentions or if she was having second thoughts about the arrangement. His questions were answered one morning when he was summoned to the throne room earlier than usual. When he arrived, he stopped short at the sight that greeted him. The throne had been modified. Where once there had been a single seat, now there were two positions: the original throne, unchanged in its magnificent isolation, and, beside it, a smaller but still elegant seat that had been seamlessly integrated into the design. The second seat was clearly subordinate to the first, positioned slightly lower and angled to show respect, but it was unmistakably part of the throne itself. The Empress was standing beside her transformed seat of power, wearing her full ceremonial regalia. She looked magnificent and terrifying, every inch the absolute ruler of a galactic empire. "Approach," she commanded. Marcus walked across the throne room on unsteady legs, still trying to process what he was seeing. When he reached the platform, the Empress gestured toward the new seat. "This is yours now, during court sessions. You will observe, you will listen, and, when I ask for your perspective, you will provide it honestly and completely. Your Majesty, I'm not dressed appropriately for such a position. I'm still wearing my janitor's uniform." "You're wearing the uniform of someone who serves the Empire faithfully and without recognition." "That's exactly the perspective I need." The Empress moved to her own seat and settled into it with practiced grace. "Take your place, Marcus Chen." With trembling hands, Marcus climbed onto the platform and sat in the seat beside the throne. The material was incredibly comfortable, and the position gave him a clear view of the entire court chamber. But what struck him most was something else entirely. For the first time in 3 years, he was visible. He was part of something larger than himself. The first court session with the modified throne was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. When the doors opened and the courtiers filed in, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Nobles pointed and whispered. Military commanders frowned in confusion. Several advisors looked as if they were considering whether to protest or flee. But the Empress handled the situation with masterful composure. She acknowledged the elephant in the room immediately, before anyone could work up the courage to question her directly. "You will notice that the throne has been modified," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber. "Marcus Chen, a human who has served faithfully in this palace, will be joining me during court sessions to provide additional perspective on imperial matters. Anyone who wishes to object to this arrangement is welcome to do so after they have demonstrated their own qualifications for questioning my judgment." The challenge was clear, and no one took it up. The Empress's authority was absolute, and challenging her decisions was tantamount to treason. The court session proceeded, though Marcus could feel hundreds of eyes on him throughout the proceedings. What surprised him was how natural it felt to sit beside the Empress. Despite his humble origins and lack of formal education, he found himself following the complex discussions about trade agreements, military deployments, and diplomatic negotiations. More importantly, he began to notice patterns and details that others seemed to miss. During a discussion about taxation policies in the agricultural sectors, Marcus observed that the planetary representatives were consistently understating their world's productive capacity while overstating their transportation costs. When the Empress asked for his thoughts during a break, he was able to point out the discrepancies he'd noticed. "The numbers don't add up," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "If their transportation costs are as high as they claim, they wouldn't be able to afford the luxury goods I've seen being delivered to their embassy quarters. And if their crop yields are as low as they're reporting, why did the palace kitchens just order increased quantities of their specialty grains?" The Empress's eyes gleamed with interest. When the session resumed, she asked pointed questions that exposed the representatives' deceptions and resulted in a more accurate assessment of their world's tax obligations. As the days passed, Marcus began to understand the true scope of his new role. The Empress didn't want him to make decisions or formulate policy, she wanted him to see what others couldn't or wouldn't show her. His outsider perspective, combined with his years of invisibility in the palace, gave him unique insights into how the empire actually functioned versus how it was supposed to function. He noticed when military reports were suspiciously vague about casualty figures. He spotted inconsistencies in trade agreements that suggested certain nobles were receiving unauthorized benefits. He observed the subtle body language and interactions that revealed hidden alliances and rivalries among the court officials. More importantly, he began to serve as a sounding board for the Empress's own thoughts and concerns. During private conversations after court sessions, she would discuss the challenges of imperial rule with a frankness that she had never been able to show to anyone else. The burden of this throne, she said one evening as they sat alone in the chamber, is not just the decisions themselves, but the knowledge that every decision affects millions of lives. Every trade agreement impacts planetary economies. Every military deployment means soldiers who might not return home. Every judicial ruling sets precedents that will echo through generations. Marcus had come to understand that the Empress's apparent coldness was not cruelty but necessity. The weight of responsibility required a certain emotional distance, ability to see beyond personal feelings to the larger implications of every action. "But, you've been carrying that burden alone for 15 years, he said. "Even the strongest person needs someone to share the load with." "Is that what you think this is?" she asked, gesturing to the modified throne. "Sharing the load? I think it's the beginning of sharing the load. Right now, I'm just helping you see more clearly. But, perhaps someday, when I understand more about how the Empire works, I can help in other ways too." The Empress smiled a real smile, not the carefully calculated expressions she wore during court sessions. "You're already helping in ways you don't realize, Marcus Chen. For the first time in years, I'm not facing every day alone. For the first time since I took this throne, I have someone beside me who asks for nothing except the opportunity to serve faithfully." As Marcus walked back to his quarters that night, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. A week ago, he had been invisible, unnoticed, content to remain in the background. Now he sat beside the most powerful being in the galaxy, offering counsel that influenced decisions affecting billions of lives. But, the most profound change wasn't in his circumstances, it was in his understanding of what leadership truly meant. The Empress wasn't just a ruler, she was a guardian of an entire civilization. And, somehow, through a combination of chance and audacity, he had become her partner in that sacred responsibility. The throne had been built for one, but it no longer held only one. And Marcus was beginning to understand that this was just the beginning of something much larger than either of them had originally envisioned. 6 months had passed since Marcus Chen first took his place beside the Wolf Empress, and the arrangement had evolved in ways that neither of them had initially anticipated. What had begun as a simple advisory role had gradually transformed into something far more significant, a true partnership in the governance of the Draknirian Empire. The court had slowly adapted to the presence of a human beside their empress, though not without considerable grumbling and political maneuvering behind closed doors. Several noble houses had attempted to undermine Marcus's position through various schemes, but each effort had only served to demonstrate his value to the empress and strengthen their working relationship. Marcus had proven his worth repeatedly. His insights had prevented 3 potential rebellions by identifying discontent before it could metastasize into violence. His understanding of logistics and resource management, gained from years of practical experience, had improved the efficiency of supply lines across 17 star systems. Most importantly, his presence had provided the Empress with something she had never had before, a trusted confidant who could help her process the enormous psychological burden of absolute power. On this particular morning, however, their partnership would face its greatest test yet. Marcus arrived at the throne room to find the Empress already there, but something was wrong. She stood before the great windows, her posture tense, her usual composure cracked. In her hand was a communication device still glowing with an urgent message. "Your Majesty?" Marcus approached carefully, recognizing the signs of barely controlled fury that he had learned to read in her body language. "The Zephyrian Confederation has declared war," she said without turning around. "They claim that human influence has corrupted the Draknirian throne and that they can no longer recognize the legitimacy of my rule. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. The Zephyrian Confederation controlled 12 star systems and commanded one of the largest military forces in the galaxy. A war with them would be devastating, potentially threatening the stability of the entire empire. "They're using me as an excuse," he said quietly. "Yes." The Empress finally turned to face him, and Marcus could see the conflict in her amber eyes. "My advisors are already recommending that I remove you from your position immediately. They believe that eliminating the source of Zephyrian objections might prevent the war from escalating." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the political reality of the situation. "They're probably right. If removing me from the throne can prevent thousands of deaths, then I should step aside." "Should you?" The Empress moved closer to him, her voice dropping to the low growl that indicated deep emotion. "Should I sacrifice the best advisor I've ever had for the temporary appeasement of enemies who were likely looking for any excuse to challenge my authority? Your Majesty, this isn't about what's best for me. It's about what's best for the Empire. And what if what's best for the Empire is standing firm against those who would dictate our internal policies?" Before Marcus could respond, the throne room doors opened and a stream of high-ranking officials entered. Admiral Corvinthek, the Empress's chief military advisor, led the group. Behind him came Chancellor Zaradok, the head of the diplomatic corps, and General Verthane, commander of the Imperial Guard. Admiral Corvinthek wasted no time with pleasantries. "Your Imperial Majesty, the Zephyrian fleet has been detected massing at the border of the Kepler system. Intelligence reports suggest they're preparing for a major offensive. We need to begin mobilizing our forces immediately. And we need to address the political situation that precipitated this crisis," Chancellor Zaradok added, shooting a meaningful glance at Marcus. "The Confederation has made their demands clear. If we act quickly to demonstrate our commitment to traditional Drakmirian values, we might still be able to negotiate a peaceful resolution." General Verthane stepped forward. "Your Majesty, I've served your family for 30 years. I've never questioned your judgment, and I won't start now. But I must point out that the human's presence beside the throne has created a symbolic problem that extends beyond the Zephyrian Confederation. Several of our own outer system governors have expressed concerns." The Empress listened to all of this with apparent calm, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight narrowing of her eyes that indicated dangerous levels of anger building beneath her composed exterior. "General Verthane," she said finally, her voice deceptively quiet, "are you suggesting that I bow to pressure from rebels and allow external forces to dictate who I choose as my advisors? I'm suggesting that we consider all available options for resolving this crisis before it becomes a full-scale war. And, Admiral, what is your assessment of our military readiness?" Admiral Corvinthek straightened. "We can win a war against the Confederation, Your Majesty, but the cost would be enormous. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, massive economic disruption, and the possibility that other hostile powers might take advantage of our distraction to launch their own attacks." The Empress turned to Marcus, and, for a moment, the vast throne room was silent except for the distant hum of the palace's environmental systems. "Marcus Chen," she said formally, "you have heard the situation and the recommendations of my senior advisors. What is your counsel?" Marcus felt the weight of every eye in the room upon him. These were some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and they were all waiting to hear what a human janitor would say about matters of war and peace. He thought about everything he had learned over the past 6 months about leadership, about the burden of responsibility, about the difference between what was expedient and what was right. Then, he thought about the conversation he'd had with the Empress just days earlier, about the loneliness of command and the importance of having someone who could share the load. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "I believe the question isn't whether removing me from this position would prevent a war. The question is what kind of empire you want to lead. Explain. If you remove me because of external pressure, you're establishing a precedent that foreign powers can influence internal Drakmirian policies by making threats. If you remove me because some of your own governors object to a human advisor, you're sending a message that bigotry and narrow-mindedness will be rewarded with policy changes." Chancellor Zaradok interrupted. "With respect, Marcus, those are philosophical considerations. We're facing a very practical military threat." "Are we?" Marcus turned to face the Chancellor. Or are we facing a test of the Empire's resolve and principles? The Zephyrians chose this issue as their justification for war because they believed it would divide us internally and weaken our response. If we give them what they want, we prove that their strategy works. If we stand firm, we prove that the Draknirian Empire cannot be manipulated by external threats. Admiral Korvanthek frowned. You're advocating for a war that could cost millions of lives. I'm advocating for a position of strength that might prevent that war from being necessary. Marcus looked back at the Empress. Your Majesty, you told me once that you built this empire through unconventional strategies. This is another moment that calls for unconventional thinking. What do you propose? Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to suggest was either brilliant or completely insane. I propose that instead of removing me from the throne to appease the Zephyrians, you double down on what I represent. Send a message to every world in the galaxy that the Draknirian Empire judges beings by their actions and abilities, not by their species or social status. Turn this crisis into an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of civilization you're building. The throne room erupted in shocked voices as the advisors reacted to this suggestion. But the Empress held up a hand for silence, her eyes fixed on Marcus with intense concentration. Continue, she said. Announce new policies that formalize merit-based advancement throughout the imperial bureaucracy and military. Create a system where any being, regardless of species or background, can earn a position of responsibility based on their contributions to the Empire. Make it clear that the Draknirian Empire is stronger precisely because it embraces diversity rather than fearing it. You're suggesting we use this crisis to implement social reforms, Chancellor Zaradok said incredulously. That's not diplomacy, it's ideological warfare. It's evolution, Marcus replied. Every great civilization reaches a point where it must choose between stagnation and growth. The Zephyrian challenge is forcing us to confront the choice earlier than we might have preferred, but the choice itself was always inevitable. General Verthane shook his head. Your Majesty, this is exactly the kind of radical thinking that created this crisis in the first place. No, General, the Empress said, rising from her throne with fluid grace. This crisis was created by those who fear change and prefer the comfort of familiar prejudices to the challenge of building something better. She moved to stand beside Marcus, a gesture that spoke volumes to everyone present. Marcus Chen has proven his value to this empire repeatedly over the past 6 months. His insights have prevented rebellions, improved our economic efficiency, and helped me make better decisions for our citizens. I will not sacrifice a valuable advisor to appease the narrow-minded fears of those who judge worth by species rather than merit. Admiral Korvanthek stepped forward. Your Majesty, if you're determined to maintain this position, then we need to prepare for war. Then, we prepare for war, the Empress said firmly. But we do so as a united empire that stands for something greater than the sum of its parts. We fight not just to defend our territory, but to defend our principles. Over the following weeks, the empire mobilized for conflict while simultaneously implementing the most progressive social reforms in galactic history. The Empress's announcement of merit-based advancement opportunities was met with enthusiasm from many species that had previously been excluded from positions of power, while creating predictable resistance from conservative elements within the empire. But something unexpected happened. Instead of weakening the empire's military readiness, the new policies actually strengthened it. Species that had previously felt marginalized threw themselves into the war effort with unprecedented enthusiasm. Humans, in particular, proved remarkably effective at logistics, engineering, and unconventional problem-solving. Marcus found himself taking on responsibilities far beyond his original advisory role. The Empress appointed him as Special Coordinator for Integration Initiatives, a position that gave him authority to implement the new merit-based policies across all branches of government and military. When the Zephyrian Confederation finally launched their attack 3 months later, they encountered not the divided, weakened empire they had expected, but a unified force fighting for ideals that transcended species loyalty. The war was indeed devastating, but it was also shorter than anyone had predicted. The turning point came during the Battle of Proxima Station, when a mixed-species task force led by a human engineer named Sarah Martinez managed to disable the Confederation's main fleet through a combination of innovative tactics and technological improvisation that no purely Draknirian force could have conceived. the victory sent shock waves throughout the galaxy. The supposedly inferior humans had not only held their ground beside the mighty Dracnirians, but had actually contributed decisively to the Empire's victory. When the Confederation finally sued for peace, they found themselves negotiating not just the end of hostilities, but their potential integration into an empire that had proven its superiority not through conquest alone, but through its ability to harness the strengths of all its citizens. The day the peace treaty was signed, Marcus sat beside the Empress on their shared throne, watching as representatives from dozens of species gathered to witness the ceremony. The throne room was fuller than it had ever been, filled with beings who had earned their places through merit rather than birth or species affiliation. "Do you ever regret it?" the Empress asked quietly as they watched the proceedings. "Accepting my offer to join me here? Your life would have been simpler if you had remained invisible." Marcus smiled, thinking about the human engineer whose innovations had won the war, the diverse advisors who now helped govern the Empire, and the millions of beings who had found new opportunities in the reformed Dracnirian system. "Your Majesty," he said, "simplicity is overrated. Besides, someone has to help you carry the load." The Empress reached over and briefly touched his hand, a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about how far they had both traveled from that first conversation 6 months earlier. The throne had been built for one, but it no longer held only one. And the empire it governed was stronger, more just, and more unified than it had ever been before. The unlikely partnership between the Wolf Empress and her human advisor had not just survived its greatest test, it had transformed an entire civilization. As the ceremony concluded and the assembled representatives began to file out of the throne room, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had started as an invisible janitor, content to remain unnoticed in the shadows. Now he sat beside the most powerful ruler in the galaxy, helping to shape policies that would affect billions of lives for generations to come. The transformation hadn't been without cost, the war had claimed thousands of lives, and the social reforms had created new challenges that would take years to fully resolve. But the empire that emerged from the crisis was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. It was a civilization that measured worth by contribution rather than species, that welcomed innovation regardless of its source, and that had proven its strength through unity rather than dominance. "What are you thinking about?" the Empress asked as the last of the representatives departed. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the most important changes begin with the smallest gestures," Marcus replied. A conversation in an empty throne room. A suggestion that seemed impossible. A decision to trust someone who had nothing to offer except a different perspective. And now? Marcus looked around the magnificent chamber that had become the symbol of a new kind of empire, one that had grown beyond its original constraints to become something greater than anyone had imagined possible. "Now I'm thinking about what we might accomplish next." The Empress smiled, and in that smile, Marcus could see not just satisfaction with what they had achieved, but anticipation for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The throne had been built for one, but it had become the foundation for something much larger, a partnership that had transformed not just their own lives, but the entire galaxy. And, in the end, that transformation had begun with a simple recognition that even the mightiest ruler needed someone to share the load, and even the humblest janitor could help carry the weight of an empire.